Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and I want to talk about Cat Williams' recent um, interview with Shannon Shea, and I want to talk about comedians who aren't funny but have arrived in the big time or have been supported by Joe Rogan, and then I want to bring that all back and talk about Dungeons and Dragons, official Hasbro Dungeons and Dragons ability to choose actual play dungeon masters, put them on blast, and why they're doing exactly what Joe Rogan does with comedians, which is support and promote and hype comedians who aren't funny. All right, let's go comparatively to the industry. All right. So first of all, let's get into this. So Cat Williams, if you don't know him, he is a. If you don't know him, well, you've been living in a cave. Like Cat Williams is extremely famous as a stand-up, right? He really is. He never really arrived on television or in movies, right? And but in stand-up, he is definitely known, right? And he is a grind stand-up, right? Brick wall and a microphone, and actually no brick walls anymore. At this point, he sells out arenas, and this is interesting. I think there's something here. I've been thinking a lot about this. I recently I read that Critical Role sold out Wembley Stadium, and then I got a correction. People were like, no, they didn't sell out Wembley Stadium. They sold out Wembley Arena, right? And there's a difference between an arena and a stadium. And I think this is interesting. And actually, I think what's really interesting there is Dungeons and Dragons is arena famous. It's not stadium famous. Right? It is famous, right? Like everybody knows it, but it doesn't sell out stadiums. It sells out arenas, right? Like and that's exactly what stand-up comedians can do. There's probably only two comedians in the world that could sell out a stadium, right? It'd probably be Dave Chappelle, maybe Jim Gaffigan. That's about it. I don't know. Oh, but Kevin Hart probably sell out a stadium. Every other comedian gets to the point where they can sell out arenas, and that's big. And I think an arena is like max like 20,000 people, right? Whereas a stadium could be 75 or 100,000 people, right? So that's the difference. But what was really interesting was Cat Williams did this, one of the most listened to podcasts, and actually it was a show. There was video, so I don't know why they're calling this a podcast. It's kind of absurd. So he did one of the most he did web content, which let's call it a podcast for simplicity's sake. Um, but it got 12 million views in a day, right? And it's probably over 50, 75 million views now, like just a ton of views, right? Like just got huge traffic, immediate engagement, right? And I think, and what's interesting is this is what Cat Williams does. He's really like he knows how to attract an audience and keep them engaged, and he is a stand-up, right? He's brick wall at a stadium and a microphone comedian. And he's an arena and a microphone stand-up, right? Just all you need to do is give him a microphone, and he's going to captivate, right? So he does this interview, and he goes off like and just tears down no less than 20 different men, right? Most of them do the same thing he does, but in his sweep, he says Joe Rogan. Now Joe Rogan is technically a stand-up, right? Like, and this is kind of like Mario Andretti. Like think of the best. Think about Ryan Gosling, and let's say that Ryan Gosling whittles, right? And you're like, oh, Whittler, Ryan Gosling. And you're like, wait a second, who cares that he? Because the reality is, at this point, Joe Rogan is really he's a podcaster, right? He does some stand-up, but nobody cares about his stand-up. People care about his podcast, which is one of the most successful podcasts on the planet. And so Cat Williams said, well, and Joe Rogan, right? And the six guys that he's promoted, none of whom are funny. And the moment he said that, I could list them in my head. I was like, holy cows, Cat Williams is right, right? And I just I counted them off in my hand. Tom Segura, huge Netflix special, not a funny joke in it, right? Bert Kreischer, right? And I kept thinking, I was like, Why is Bert Kreischer selling out arenas, right? Bobby Lee, Theo Vaughn, Joey Diaz. Oh, and the worst one, Andrew Santino. Every one of these guys, he's had them on so many times you can't even count, right? And he's promoting that, and he's bringing them onto the show, which is a huge platform, so that these guys so people know them, they have name recognition, and then they can sell out arenas. But ain't one of them funny. None of them are funny, right? Like, none of them are funny, right? And Joe is picking them and promoting them over other comedians, which you're like, that is really weird. The moment I heard this, I was like, what's going on with Dungeons and Dragons and Dungeon Masters, right? And I think it's similar there, right? So Hasbro Dungeons and Dragons has the ability, it has a budget to bring on official Dungeon Masters and start official campaigns. But what's wild is not one official Hasbro D&D presentation of any Dungeon Master has ever really put forward a Dungeon Master that excites people more than Matthew Mercer, right? Matthew Mercer is the best Dungeon Master in the world. No one's been able to surpass him. But Hasbro D&D has this platform. They should be able to surpass him. They could do, and I think this is part of the reason why. They want to present Dungeon Masters that they like, but not Dungeon Masters that are good, which is exactly what Joe Rogan does with comedians, right? He brings on these comedians who are friends of his, but aren't funny at all, right? Like, and literally, Cat Williams has like the idea, right, that you would have Tom Segura, right, Bert Kreischer, Andrew Santino, Theo Vaughn, Joey Diaz, right, and there's another one in there. You know, and these 6 guys who none of them could hold a candle to Cat Williams, and Joe Rogan has never had Cat Williams on, right? Kind of absurd, right? Like, and it's the same thing with D&D. They trot out these bad Dungeon Masters that are completely unforgettable, or not even. I think they've had some Dungeon Masters that are not terrible, but they're very forgettable, and they have been forgotten, right? Kind of swept off. None of their stuff really clicked. Everybody was like, I've had enough of that. Like, because they don't iterate, right? Like, they don't innovate. They don't innovate. They actually very much do iterate. They just do the same thing over and over and over and over. And so this really made me think, like, so one, Cat Williams is right. Joe Rogan, you know, who started his own comedy club. For what? Not to bring funny people, but to make his friends more famous and more wealthy comedians. Right, which is, you know, like, you know, is that useful, right? And then Dungeons and Dragons has this platform. They can put on blast the greatest dungeon masters in the world, but frankly, they ain't even looking for them, right? By now, we should add, hey, you know, here's Dungeon Master tryouts. They're on the East Coast, they're on the West Coast, and we're gonna do one in Chicago too. And that way, you know, and get in your car and travel, and you know, try it, and then we're gonna find the best Dungeon Master in America. And we're gonna give them a six session arc, and we're gonna do that all year. And the best are gonna come out, and they're gonna be, you know, and D&D hasn't done any of that, right? Like they choose dungeon masters that are, and actually, I don't think the dungeon masters that that Dungeons and Dragons chooses are bad. They're just eminently forgettable. They're just so forgettable, right? And they quite literally have been forgotten by me and by the public. So I thought that was really interesting, and you know, it's in my vein of Cat Williams don't really think about Dungeons and Dragons. I don't think Cat Williams thinks about Dungeons and Dragons, but man, this stuff made me think about the problem we have with Hasbro D&D public prominent dungeon masters, and Hasbro D&D has the ability to put forward powerful to make dungeon masters famous, and they're not. Right? They're not seeking out the best dungeon masters, and they certainly aren't giving them a forum. And that is a huge problem that needs to get fixed, in my humble opinion. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.